I still remember the exact moment I knew my marriage was over. It wasn't the discovery itself, though that was gut-wrenching. It was the realization that he had created a whole other world, a world where he was attentive, devoted, and passionate. But it wasn't my world. The first clue came unexpectedly. It was a sunny Thursday afternoon, and I was in the kitchen making lunch for the kids. My phone pinged with a message from him. Well, it was supposed to be for me. He sent a screenshot of an Amazon order for a set of new school supplies for the kids. At the bottom of the image, almost like an afterthought, was another delivery address. Not ours. Not even in our city. At first, I thought it was a mistake. A work thing, maybe. But as the uneasy feeling spread through me, I started to piece it together. That night, when he fell asleep, I checked his email. I don't know why I did it. I had never snooped before. But something about that address gnawed at me. My gut had been whispering for weeks, and now it screamed. And there it all was. A digital trail of lies, an archive of someone I barely recognized. Her name was Emma. Emails about how much he loved her laugh, how her smile brightened his day. Venmo payments with coy little notes, for our escape, dinner with my favorite girl. I felt like I was reading someone else's life, some stranger's romance novel, and I was the villain in the story. The worst part wasn't that he had been unfaithful. It wasn't even that they'd been talking for a month, meeting for lunch breaks, or that he'd started picking her up from work. No, the part that broke me was how he spoke to her. He wrote to her like she was the greatest thing that had ever happened to him. He called her beautiful, special. Words he hadn't said to me in years. I didn't confront him right away. Instead, I let the knowledge sit with me, simmering like a quiet storm. I knew I couldn't just accuse him without evidence, so I started collecting it. Emails, text messages, receipts. I even found a confirmation for a reservation at some romantic inn, one he had claimed was a work trip. By the end of the week, I had a folder thick enough to make my case airtight. But this wasn't a court case. This was my life. That weekend, he came home late. He reeked of some unfamiliar cologne, and his smile seemed lighter, freer. As he stood in the doorway, fiddling with his keys, I couldn't help but stare at him. How could he look so normal? How could he just walk into this house, kiss our children goodnight, and pretend that everything was fine? I felt a fire rising in me, a rage I hadn't known I was capable of. But I didn't let it show. Not yet. Instead, I smiled back. Long day? I asked, keeping my tone light. He nodded, mumbled something about meetings running late, and shuffled upstairs. I sat on the couch, the weight of the truth pressing down on me, and thought about what to do next. This wasn't a story about a simple mistake. It wasn't about one night of poor judgment or a fleeting infatuation. This was a deliberate betrayal, a choice he made, over and over, every time he picked up the phone or showed up at her workplace or wrote her those nauseatingly sweet emails. The next morning, I called my best friend, Lila. She came over with coffee and pastries, and we sat on the back porch while the kids played in the yard. I told her everything. The emails, the texts, the lies. She listened quietly, her face a mask of controlled anger. When I finished, she didn't hesitate. "You deserve better than this," she said, her voice steady. "You need to confront him. You need to leave." Her words hit me like a freight train. Leave. The word was as foreign as it was terrifying. For 13 years, this man had been my partner, the father of my children. Walking away felt like cutting off a limb. But staying? Staying felt like losing myself completely. I knew she was right. But knowing and doing are two very different things. I spent the next few days in a fog. Every time he smiled at me or asked about dinner plans, it felt like I was watching a play I didn't want to be in. I didn't recognize this man anymore, and I didn't recognize myself either. I was quieter, more calculating, but not in a way I liked. It was survival. I had to hold it together, for the kids, for my own sanity, until I had my plan. Lila became my lifeline. She kept me grounded when I wanted to scream, encouraged me when I second-guessed myself. "You need to decide what you want this to look like," she said one afternoon while we sat in her kitchen. "Do you want him to leave? Do you want to fight for the house? What's your endgame?" The truth was, I didn't know. I had no roadmap for this kind of betrayal. All I knew was that I couldn't live like this, not anymore. By the end of the week, I had a plan. I wasn't going to confront him in some emotional explosion of accusations. That's what he'd expect, and I refused to give him that power. No, I wanted him to feel every ounce of the betrayal he'd inflicted on me. I wanted him to see the fallout of his actions in real time. It started with the suitcase. Saturday morning, while he was in the shower, I took one of his carry-ons and packed it carefully. Not with clothes, oh no, I wasn't letting him off that easy. Inside, I placed a neatly written letter, 10 pages long, detailing every single thing I knew. Every email, every receipt, every lie. I told him how I'd found out, how I'd spent weeks collecting evidence. How I'd felt, watching him slip away from our family. And then, in the last section, I addressed her directly. "Emma," I wrote, "if you're reading this, congratulations. You've won. But just so we're clear, you haven't won a prize. You've won a man who lies as easily as he breathes. A man who abandons his family for a fantasy. Enjoy him, because I sure don't want him anymore." I taped the letter inside the lining of the suitcase, zipped it shut, and slid it back into the closet. He had no idea it was there. The next step was harder. I had to keep acting normal. That evening, we had dinner as a family. He talked about work, about how busy he'd been. I nodded along, biting back the urge to ask him about his work trip with Emma. The kids laughed at his jokes, blissfully unaware of the storm brewing under the surface. The following morning, he left for another work trip. I kissed him on the cheek as he walked out the door, the same way I always did. "Have a safe flight," I said, my voice steady. He smiled, oblivious. "I'll text you when I land." As soon as his car disappeared down the street, I sprang into action. I sent a group text to him and Emma, attaching a photo of our family from last Christmas. "I hope you both enjoy your trip," I wrote. "There's a letter in your suitcase, just in case you're curious. Consider it a farewell gift." I blocked his number before he could respond. That evening, I sat on the couch with a glass of wine in hand, waiting for the fallout. Lila sat beside me, her phone on the coffee table in case he tried to reach out through someone else. The first call came an hour later, from an unknown number. I didn't answer. Then another. And another. By the fourth call, Lila grabbed the phone and answered for me. "She doesn't want to talk to you," she said, her tone icy. "You've done enough." She hung up before he could respond. It wasn't until later that night that the reality started to sink in. I stared at the empty space in our bed, the silence of the house pressing in on me. This was it. The beginning of the end. The next morning, I woke up to a flurry of text messages. Friends, family, even a few of his coworkers were reaching out. Somehow, the news had already started to spread. I wasn't ashamed, though. If anything, I felt relieved. The weight of secrecy was gone, and with it, the power he'd held over me. I spent the rest of the day packing up his things. Box after box, I filled with his clothes, his books, his stupid collectible action figures. By the time I was done, the garage was stacked to the ceiling with reminders of him. It felt cathartic, in a way, like I was reclaiming my space, my life. That evening, Lila came over with takeout and a bottle of champagne. "To new beginnings," she said, raising her glass. I laughed, the first real laugh I'd had in weeks. To freedom. But even as I smiled, I couldn't shake the feeling of dread that lingered in the back of my mind. This wasn't over, not yet. By Monday morning, the gravity of my actions began to settle in. It wasn't regret, exactly, but the weight of what I'd set into motion was undeniable. I had shattered the fragile illusion of our marriage and dropped the truth squarely into his lap, and hers. Now, I just had to brace myself for what came next. That afternoon, he finally managed to reach me. I'd forgotten to block his work number. The call came while I was sorting laundry, and for some reason, I answered it without thinking. "Why would you do this?" he asked. His voice was tight, almost panicked. Not angry, yet, but not calm, either. "Do what?" I replied, my tone sharper than I intended. "This," he said, exasperated. "The text. The letter. You could have just talked to me." I laughed, bitter and cold. "Talk to you? Like you talked to me about Emma?" "Spare me, David." There was a long silence. I could almost hear him trying to think of what to say next, fumbling for damage control. "I was going to tell you," he said finally, his voice quieter. "I just didn't know how." "Of course you didn't," I snapped. "Because it's easier to sneak around, isn't it? Easier to live a double life than to be honest with your wife." He sighed, and for a moment, I thought I heard regret in his voice. But then he said, "I didn't want to hurt you." That did it. "Hurt me?" I repeated, incredulous. "David, you didn't just hurt me. You humiliated me. You lied to me, over and over. And you didn't care how it would affect me, or the kids, or anyone else. Don't you dare pretend this was about protecting me." He didn't respond. Maybe he knew there was nothing he could say that would make it better. Or maybe he just didn't care enough to try. "You got what you wanted," I continued. "You wanted her, and now you have her. So don't call me asking why I did this. You did this, David. Not me." I hung up before he could respond. That evening, the doorbell rang. When I opened it, I was greeted by 2 suitcases sitting neatly on the porch. There was no note, no explanation, just the sharp finality of his things staring back at me. My heart sank. For a brief, foolish moment, I thought he might have sent them as some kind of peace offering, a gesture of guilt, maybe. But when I opened the first suitcase, my stomach turned. Inside were the gifts I'd given him over the years, a watch from our 10th anniversary, a hand-knit scarf I'd made when we first started dating, even the photo album I'd put together of our family vacations. All of it, dumped unceremoniously back at my feet. It felt like a slap in the face. He didn't just want to leave, he wanted to erase me. Lila came over that night and found me sitting on the floor of the living room, the suitcase contents spread out around me. "What happened?" she asked, her voice soft. I held up the watch, the one I'd spent months saving for, and gave her a humorless laugh. "He sent this back." Her jaw tightened, and she sat down beside me, pulling me into a hug. "He's an idiot," she said firmly. "He doesn't deserve you. Or any of this." I nodded, but her words did little to dull the ache in my chest. I knew she was right, but it didn't make it hurt any less. The next few days passed in a haze. David hadn't come home, but he hadn't officially moved out, either. It was like he was in limbo, unable to commit to leaving entirely but unwilling to face me. Then, on Wednesday morning, I woke up to find an envelope slipped under the front door. It was his handwriting on the outside, scrawled messily in pen. Inside was a short note. "I know I've hurt you. I didn't mean for it to happen this way. I'll come by this weekend to talk about the kids. I'm sorry. Sorry." Such a small, inadequate word. I crumpled the note and tossed it into the trash. Sorry wasn't going to fix this. By the time Saturday rolled around, I was ready for a fight. I spent the morning cleaning the house, more out of nervous energy than anything else. When his car pulled into the driveway that afternoon, my heart pounded in my chest. I watched through the window as he stepped out, looking far too calm for someone who had shattered my life. I opened the door before he could knock. "You're here for the kids?" I asked, not bothering with pleasantries. He nodded. Yeah. I thought we could talk, too. I crossed my arms, leaning against the doorframe. About what? About how you lied to me for months? About how you threw everything we built away for some fling? His jaw tightened, but he didn't rise to the bait. I just want to make this as easy as possible, he said evenly. Easy? I laughed bitterly. You think there's an easy way to destroy a family? Newsflash, David, you already burned it to the ground. He looked down, as if the cracks in the pavement were suddenly fascinating. I'm sorry, he said again, his voice barely above a whisper. I shook my head, stepping back to let him in. Save it, I muttered. The kids are in the living room. He stepped into the house cautiously, like a stranger unsure of his welcome. And honestly, that's what he was now, a stranger. It felt surreal to watch him walk into the living room where the kids were sprawled on the floor, playing with their toy cars. Their faces lit up when they saw him, and they ran to him like nothing was wrong. Daddy, my youngest exclaimed, wrapping his little arms around David's legs. For a second, I saw a flicker of guilt on his face as he knelt to hug them. Maybe it was real. Maybe it wasn't. I didn't trust myself to know the difference anymore. He stayed with them for a while, helping build a Lego spaceship and listening to their stories about school. I stayed in the kitchen, wiping the same spotless counter over and over, trying to steady the storm inside me. He was playing the part of the good dad now, but I knew better. I knew where his priorities truly lay. When he finally came into the kitchen, the tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife. He leaned against the doorway, watching me dry dishes I'd already cleaned. You're doing this on purpose, I said without looking up. What? He asked, caught off guard. Dragging it out. Coming here, acting like you care. I turned to face him, my voice calm but ice cold. If you want to see the kids, fine. But don't pretend you're still part of this family. He sighed heavily, running a hand through his hair. I'm not pretending. I love the kids. I'll always love them. And me? I asked before I could stop myself. The words were out there now, raw and vulnerable. He looked away, his silence louder than any answer he could have given. After he left that afternoon, I felt drained. The kids didn't seem to notice anything was amiss. They waved cheerfully as he drove away, already chattering about what they'd built together. But I noticed. I felt every moment of his absence as if it were a new wound. I couldn't go on like this limbo where nothing was resolved, and everything hurt. So that evening, I sat down at my computer and began drafting an email. Not to him. To her. The email was short, direct, and stripped of emotion. Emma. You don't know me, but I think it's time we talked. I'm not writing this to fight or to point fingers. I'm writing this because my children are involved, and they deserve better than the chaos your relationship has caused. If you're serious about David, we need to discuss boundaries and expectations. Let me know when you're ready to have that conversation. Catherine. I hovered over the send button for a long time. Was this the right move? Was I giving her more attention than she deserved? I didn't know. But I sent it anyway. She responded the next day. Catherine. I understand why you're upset, and I'm sorry for my part in everything. I'd like to talk, but I need some time to figure out what to say. I hope you understand. Emma. It wasn't much, but it was something. At least she wasn't pretending to be innocent in all this. Still, her email left a bad taste in my mouth. The way she phrased it, my part in everything, made it sound like this was some unfortunate misunderstanding, not a calculated betrayal. Lila, of course, had plenty to say about it. She's trying to make herself look like the victim, she said, rolling her eyes as we sat on the porch that evening. Don't fall for it. I won't, I assured her. But the truth was, I wasn't so sure. Emma wasn't the one who had promised to love me for better or worse. She wasn't the one who had vowed to be faithful. She was just a symptom of a much bigger problem. The following week, David came by again to see the kids. This time, he didn't linger in the living room or make small talk in the kitchen. He went straight to the point. "I signed a lease," he said, standing stiffly in the hallway as I handed him the kids' backpacks. "Good for you," I replied, my tone flat. "It's not far," he continued, as if I'd asked. "I want to stay close to the boys." I nodded, not trusting myself to speak. It was the first real step he'd taken toward leaving, and for some reason, it hit me harder than I expected. He was actually doing it, moving out, moving on. And I hated how much it hurt, even though it was exactly what I'd wanted. That night, after the kids were asleep, I went into the garage and stared at the boxes I'd packed with his things. It felt like a scene from someone else's life, a stranger's drama unfolding in my home. How had we gone from movie nights and family vacations to this? How had he turned into the man who could look me in the eye and still lie? I opened one of the boxes and pulled out a photo album, flipping through the pages. There we were, smiling on our honeymoon, holding our newborn sons, laughing at some long-forgotten joke. I felt the tears welling up before I could stop them, and I let them fall. This wasn't just about him leaving. It was about everything we'd lost, everything I'd thought we were building together. And now, all of it was gone. The weeks that followed felt like wading through quicksand. David came by twice a week to see the kids, each visit a reminder of what we'd lost. He tried to stay civil, even friendly, but there was a weight in his voice that he couldn't hide. Guilt, maybe. Or something else. I didn't ask. One evening, after the kids had gone to bed, he lingered in the doorway longer than usual. I could feel his hesitation, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. "Is there something you need?" I asked, keeping my tone neutral. He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture I knew all too well. I want to talk." "About?" I folded my arms, bracing myself. "Everything." He looked at me, his eyes softer than they'd been in weeks. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you." I raised an eyebrow, waiting for him to continue. This wasn't the first time he'd tried to apologize, and I doubted it would be the last. "I don't know how it got to this point," he said, his voice low. "I didn't mean for it to happen." "Didn't mean for what to happen?" I asked, my anger bubbling to the surface. "The lies? The affair? Or are you talking about the fact that you got caught?" He winced, but I didn't care. He needed to hear this. "You didn't just mess up, David. You made a choice. Over and over. You chose her. You chose to lie. You chose to throw away everything we built." "I know," he said, barely audible. "I hate myself for it." "Good," I snapped. "You should." For a moment, neither of us spoke. The silence hung heavy between us, thick with everything left unsaid. "I still care about you," he said finally. "I always will." I laughed, bitter and sharp. "Care about me? You don't care about me, David. If you did, you wouldn't have done this. You don't care about anyone but yourself." "That's not true," he protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "Then prove it," I shot back. "Stop trying to play the victim. Stop pretending you're the good guy in this story." He opened his mouth to respond, but I didn't give him the chance. "You want to talk about everything? Fine. Let's talk about how you looked me in the eye and lied. Let's talk about how you used your work trips as an excuse to see her. Let's talk about the emails, the gifts, the romantic getaways. Let's talk about the fact that you didn't even have the decency to tell me the truth. I had to find out on my own." His shoulders slumped, and for the first time, I saw the fight drain out of him. "You're right," he said quietly. "I don't deserve your forgiveness." "No, you don't," I agreed. "And you're not getting it." When he left that night, I felt a strange mix of relief and emptiness. I had stood my ground, said everything I needed to say, but it didn't feel like a victory. If anything, it felt like a loss, of the man I thought I'd married, of the life I thought we'd have. The next day, Emma emailed me again. Catherine. I think we should meet. There's a lot I need to say, and I'd rather do it face to face. Let me know when you're available. Emma. I stared at the email for a long time, my cursor hovering over the reply button. Part of me wanted to ignore it, to shut the door on her the way I was trying to shut the door on him. But another part of me, the part that needed closure, couldn't let it go. I replied with a single sentence, tomorrow at 2 p.m., the cafe on Maple Street. The next afternoon, I walked into the cafe with my heart pounding in my chest. Emma was already there, sitting at a table near the window. She looked exactly how I'd imagined, polished, poised, and painfully young. She stood when she saw me, offering a hesitant smile. Catherine, she said, extending her hand. I ignored it and sat down across from her. Let's skip the pleasantries. She nodded, sitting back down. For a moment, she just looked at me, as if trying to gauge my mood. I didn't mean for any of this to happen, she began, her voice soft. I didn't know he was married at first. Don't lie to me, I interrupted. You knew. Her face flushed, and she looked down at her coffee. You're right. I did. So, what is this? I asked, gesturing between us. Why are we here? She hesitated, then took a deep breath. I wanted to apologize. For everything. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I needed you to hear it. I stared at her, searching for any sign of sincerity. Do you love him? She blinked, surprised by the question. I thought I did, she admitted. But now? I don't know. Good, I said, my voice steely. Because he's not the man you think he is. He's a liar, Emma. He lied to me, and he'll lie to you too. She nodded, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. I'm sorry, she said again, her voice barely above a whisper. I stood, grabbing my coat. I don't need your apology. I need you to stay away from my family. And with that, I walked out, leaving her sitting alone in the cafe. After my meeting with Emma, something shifted in me. For weeks, I'd been stuck in survival mode, reacting, planning, and fighting. But as I walked out of that cafe and into the cold winter air, I realized something. I was done fighting. Not for him, not against him, not for the ghost of what we used to be. It was time to stop looking back. That night, as I sat on the couch sipping tea, I opened my laptop and started researching divorce lawyers. Up until that point, I'd been avoiding the word, even in my own head. Divorce felt so final, so heavy. But now, it didn't scare me anymore. It felt like freedom. The kids were asleep upstairs, their soft snores drifting through the baby monitor I still kept out of habit. I thought about them as I typed, wondering how I'd explain all of this in a way that wouldn't hurt them. They deserved better than this mess. Better than him. Better than us. The next morning, David called. I considered ignoring it but decided to answer. I wasn't afraid of him anymore. What do you want? I said, skipping the pleasantries. I heard you met with Emma, he said, his voice guarded. That's right. Why? He asked, his tone sharper now. Because I needed answers, I said simply. And because I wanted her to see the truth about the man she's chasing. He sighed heavily, but I didn't give him a chance to respond. Look, David, I continued, this isn't about her. It's about you. You destroyed this marriage, not her. And I'm not going to waste another second trying to fix something you decided wasn't worth saving. There was silence on the other end of the line. Finally, he spoke, his voice quieter than before. What are you saying? I'm saying I want a divorce. I expected him to argue, to fight me on it, but he didn't. He just said, okay. It was the final confirmation I didn't know I needed. He didn't even want to try. He was just as ready to walk away as I was, maybe even more so. The next few weeks were a whirlwind of paperwork and logistics. I hired a lawyer, who assured me I had nothing to worry about. The house was in my name, as were most of our assets. David, ever the minimalist, had never cared much about material things, which worked in my favor. The hardest part would be figuring out custody arrangements for the kids. Surprisingly, David was cooperative. He agreed to joint custody without a fight, even though I knew he wouldn't be around much. He still hadn't moved out of state, but I could see the restlessness in him. It was only a matter of time before he packed up and left for good. One evening, as I was tucking the kids into bed, my youngest looked up at me with wide, curious eyes. "Mommy, why doesn't Daddy live here anymore?" he asked. I froze, my hand hovering over his blanket. I'd known this question was coming, but nothing could have prepared me for how much it would hurt to hear it. "Daddy and I decided it's better for us to live in different houses," I said gently. "But he still loves you very much, and so do I." "Did you have a fight?" he pressed. I hesitated, then nodded. "We had some big fights, yes. But it's not your fault, sweetheart. Sometimes grown-ups just can't get along." He seemed to accept that answer, but his little brow furrowed in thought. "Will he come back someday?" I felt the lump rise in my throat. "I don't know," I admitted. "But no matter what, you'll always have both of us. We'll just be in different places." He nodded slowly, then wrapped his arms around my neck. "I love you, Mommy." "I love you too, baby," I whispered, holding him tightly. Later that night, I sat on the couch, staring at the divorce papers spread out on the coffee table. The house was quiet, save for the hum of the heater. I picked up a pen, my hand trembling slightly, and signed my name at the bottom of the page. It was done. The next morning, I called David and told him the papers were ready. He didn't say much, just that he'd come by to sign them later that week. There was no anger, no sadness, just a quiet resignation. It was fitting, in a way. Our marriage had ended not with a bang, but with a long, drawn-out whimper. The day he came to sign the papers was the first time I'd seen him since our last argument. He looked tired, older somehow, like the weight of his choices was finally catching up to him. He didn't make small talk or try to explain himself. He just sat at the dining table, pen in hand, and signed his name. When he was done, he stood and looked at me. "Is this what you want?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "It's what I need," I said, my tone firm. He nodded, his shoulders slumping. "I'm sorry," he said again, but this time, it sounded like he meant it. "I know," I replied. "But it's too late." He left without another word, and I watched from the window as his car disappeared down the street. For the first time in months, I felt something close to peace. The day the divorce was finalized was colder than I'd expected for early spring. I remember standing outside the courthouse, my hands shoved deep into my coat pockets, watching as couples passed by, some laughing, some arguing, some holding hands. Life moved on for them, just as it would for me. I didn't feel triumphant or broken. I felt free. The kind of freedom that comes with knowing the worst had already happened, and somehow, I'd survived it. Lila was waiting for me in the parking lot with a coffee in hand. "How do you feel?" she asked, searching my face. "Lighter," I admitted, taking the cup. "But also, empty." She nodded, wrapping an arm around my shoulder. "That's normal. You just lost something you thought you'd have forever. But you'll fill that emptiness eventually. I promise." I wanted to believe her. I really did. But the truth was, I didn't know who I was without him. For 13 years, I'd built my life around our marriage, our family. Now that it was gone, I didn't know where to start. That evening, after the kids were asleep, I went through the last of the boxes in the garage. Most of it was junk, old clothes, outdated electronics, things David hadn't bothered to take. But at the bottom of one box, I found a stack of letters. They were from me, written during the first few years of our relationship. I sat on the cold concrete floor, reading through them one by one. Each letter was a snapshot of who I used to be, young, hopeful, and hopelessly in love. I wrote about our dreams, our plans for the future. I wrote about how safe he made me feel, how I couldn't imagine a life without him. By the time I reached the last letter, tears were streaming down my face. I wasn't crying for him. I was crying for her, for the version of me who had believed so deeply in forever. I tucked the letters back into the box and carried it to the curb. It was time to let go of the past. Over the next few weeks, I threw myself into creating a new normal. I signed the boys up for soccer, rearranged the furniture, and started cooking meals that I liked, instead of the ones I'd made to please David. It was small, insignificant changes at first, but they felt monumental to me. The house felt different without him in it. Quieter, yes, but also lighter. There was no longer a tension hanging in the air, no silent battles over who would do the dishes or who forgot to pay the electric bill. It was just me and the kids, figuring it out as we went. I started seeing a therapist, too. At first, I was hesitant. What could a stranger possibly tell me that I didn't already know? But Dr. Bailey was kind and patient, and she had a way of asking questions that made me think in ways I hadn't before. "What are you holding on to?" she asked during our third session. "I don't know," I said, fiddling with the hem of my sweater. "Maybe, the idea of what could have been. What I thought we'd have." She nodded thoughtfully. "It's okay to mourn that. But don't let it keep you from seeing what's ahead." One day, while scrolling through social media, I came across a photo of David. He was sitting on a beach somewhere, his arms slung around Emma's shoulders. They both looked happy, carefree. For a moment, my heart twisted in my chest. Not because I missed him, but because it felt unfair. He had destroyed everything, and yet here he was, living his best life as if nothing had happened. I closed the app and stared out the window, the ache in my chest slowly fading. Let him have his happiness, I thought. It wouldn't last. Real life had a way of catching up to people like him. The kids were resilient in ways I hadn't anticipated. They missed him, of course, but they adapted quickly to the new routine. On the nights he had them, I'd sit in the quiet of the house, trying to figure out who I was outside of being a wife and a mother. One night, I found myself digging through old photo albums, searching for pieces of me that had been buried under years of compromise and sacrifice. There I was, smiling with friends at a college party, hiking through the mountains, painting on a sunlit patio. I'd forgotten about that girl. She felt like a stranger now, but I wanted to find her again. The first step was getting out of the house. Lila dragged me to a local art class, even though I insisted I didn't have a creative bone in my body. To my surprise, I loved it. There was something therapeutic about putting paint to canvas, about creating something that was entirely my own. From there, it snowballed. I started running in the mornings, signing up for yoga classes, reconnecting with old friends. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was living. One evening, as I was tucking my eldest into bed, he looked up at me with a serious expression. "Are you happy, Mommy?" he asked. The question caught me off guard. "Why do you ask, sweetheart?" "Because you smile more now," he said simply. "You didn't smile as much before." Tears pricked at my eyes as I kissed his forehead. "I am happy," I said, my voice steady. "And I'm only going to get happier." The summer crept in quietly, bringing with it the warmth of long days and the promise of a fresh start. It had been 3 months since the divorce was finalized, and though the scars of it still lingered, they didn't ache as sharply as they once did. Life was starting to feel normal again. David's visits with the kids had settled into a predictable rhythm. He picked them up every other weekend and took them to his new apartment, a modest 2-bedroom in a nearby complex. They'd come home with stories of movies they'd watched and pizza dinners they'd had, but there was always an undercurrent of something unspoken. One evening, as I was tucking my youngest into bed, he blurted out, "Daddy doesn't play with us like he used to." I paused, caught off guard. What do you mean, sweetie? He's on his phone a lot, he said, fidgeting with his blanket. And he talks to Emma more than us. The name hung in the air like a sharp note. I forced myself to stay calm. I'm sorry, baby, I said softly. But you can always tell me how you're feeling, right? He nodded, his small face scrunched in thought. I just wish things were like before. So did I. But instead of saying that, I hugged him tight and whispered, me too. That night, I lay awake thinking about his words. I'd tried so hard to shield them from the fallout, to give them a sense of stability amidst the chaos. But there were some things I couldn't protect them from, no matter how much I wanted to. It made me even more determined to build a life for us, a life that wasn't defined by what we'd lost, but by what we could gain. I threw myself into the summer. We spent weekends at the park, afternoons baking cookies, and long evenings catching fireflies in the backyard. I wanted the boys to remember this as a season of joy, not one of heartbreak. On a whim, I booked a weekend trip to the mountains. Just me and the boys, away from the weight of everything that had happened. We hiked trails, roasted marshmallows by a campfire, and laughed until our stomachs hurt. For the first time in a long time, I felt whole. Not because of anyone else, but because I had created this happiness with my own hands. One night, as we sat under a blanket of stars, my eldest turned to me and said, "This is the best day ever." I smiled, the knot in my chest loosening. Mine too, buddy. Back at home, I started to notice small but significant changes in myself. I wasn't just surviving anymore, I was thriving. I signed up for more art classes, joined a local book club, and even started volunteering at a community garden. Each new experience felt like a step closer to rediscovering the woman I used to be, the one who had dreams and hobbies and a life outside of her marriage. Lila, of course, was my biggest cheerleader. "You're glowing," she said one evening as we sat on my porch, sipping wine. "I've never seen you like this." "I think I forgot how to be happy for a while," I admitted. "But now, I feel like I'm coming back to life." "You deserve it," she said, raising her glass. "To the new you." One day, as I was weeding the garden, my phone buzzed with a message. It was from David. "Can we talk?" I stared at the screen, debating whether to respond. It had been weeks since our last interaction, and I wasn't sure I wanted to open that door again. But curiosity got the better of me. "What is it?" I texted back. He replied almost immediately. "It's about the kids. And us." Us. The word felt foreign now, like it belonged to a different lifetime. But I agreed to meet him anyway, if only to hear what he had to say. We met at a coffee shop the following afternoon. He looked different, tired, worn down. It was a stark contrast to the man I'd once known. "I've been thinking a lot," he began, stirring his coffee. "About everything. About what I did. About what I lost." I said nothing, letting him fill the silence. "I messed up," he continued, his voice thick with regret. "I know that. I don't expect you to forgive me, but I wanted you to know that I'm sorry. Truly." For the first time in months, I believed him. But that didn't change anything. "I appreciate that," I said carefully. "But it doesn't undo what happened." "I know," he said, nodding. "But I want to be better. For the kids. For myself. That's all I've ever wanted," I replied. We sat in silence for a while, the weight of our shared history hanging between us. Finally, he said, "You seem happy." "I am," I said simply. And for the first time, it felt true. That evening, as I watched the boys play in the yard, I realized something. I wasn't angry anymore. I wasn't holding on to the pain or the resentment. I had let it go, not for him, but for me. This was my life now, a life I was building piece by piece. And for the first time, it felt like mine. As the summer slipped into autumn, the rhythm of our new life began to feel natural. The mornings were filled with school drop-offs, work calls, and hurried breakfasts. Evenings were calmer, dinner at the table, stories before bed, and quiet moments to myself. It wasn't perfect, but it was ours, and that made it enough. One crisp October evening, I stood on the sidelines of my eldest son's soccer game. The air smelled like damp leaves and the faint tang of hot chocolate from a nearby concession stand. My youngest was running around with a group of siblings too young to play, his laughter carrying over the sound of cheering parents. I was laughing at something one of the other moms said when I spotted him, David. He stood at the far end of the field, hands stuffed into his jacket pockets, his face partially obscured by the brim of a baseball cap. He hadn't told me he was coming, but I suppose he didn't need my permission. He stayed at a distance, watching quietly, his expression unreadable. When the game ended, my son ran to him, excitement lighting up his face. I hung back, letting them have their moment, but when my son waved me over, I had no choice but to join them. "Mommy. Daddy saw me score," my son exclaimed, practically bouncing on his toes. "That's great, sweetheart," I said, offering David a polite nod. David smiled down at him, then looked at me. "You've got quite the soccer star here." "We do," I corrected, emphasizing the shared responsibility. He seemed to understand, nodding in agreement. The exchange was brief, but it wasn't tense. It was progress. A few days later, I got a call from Emma. Her name flashing on my screen felt like a ghost I wasn't ready to face. I hesitated before answering. "Hello?" I said cautiously. "Hi, Catherine," she said, her voice quieter than I remembered. "I hope this isn't a bad time." "It depends," I replied, not bothering to mask the wariness in my tone. "What do you want?" I wanted to apologize. "Again," she said. "I know we already talked, but I feel like I need to say it one more time. I'm sorry for everything. For my part in it." I sighed, unsure what to say. I'd spent so much time thinking about her, resenting her, blaming her. But now that she was on the other end of the line, I felt nothing. She wasn't my problem anymore. "Okay," I said finally. "I hear you." There was a pause, then she said, "David and I aren't together anymore." That surprised me. "Really?" "Yeah," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. It didn't work." "I thought you'd want to know." I didn't know how to feel about that. Part of me wanted to revel in her failure, to see it as justice for what she'd done. But another part of me, the part that was tired of carrying anger, just felt indifferent. "I hope you find what you're looking for," I said, my tone neutral. "Thank you," she replied. "I hope you do too." When I hung up, I stared at my phone for a long time, processing what she'd said. David was single again. The thought should have felt like some kind of vindication, but it didn't. It was just a fact. And that's when I realized, I really was over it. That weekend, I decided to do something I hadn't done in years. I went on a date. It wasn't planned. A friend from the book club had introduced me to her brother, Tom, and he'd asked me to dinner. I said yes on a whim, more out of curiosity than anything else. Tom was kind, funny, and easy to talk to. He asked about the kids, my hobbies, even my career, things David had rarely taken an interest in. For the first time in what felt like forever, I found myself laughing without reservation. When he walked me to my car at the end of the night, he smiled and said, "You're amazing, you know that?" I blushed, something I hadn't done in years. "Thank you. Tonight was nice." "It was," he agreed. "I'd like to see you again, if you're open to it." I hesitated, not because I wasn't interested, but because it was all so new. "I'd like that too," I said finally. Dating again was strange and exhilarating all at once. Tom wasn't perfect, but he was thoughtful in ways that felt foreign to me. He texted to ask how my day was, brought flowers for no reason, and listened, really listened, when I spoke. It was terrifying and wonderful, and I wasn't sure what to do with it. I kept him separate from the boys at first, not wanting to complicate things. But after a few months, I started to wonder if there might be a future there. He wasn't trying to replace David, he was just trying to be present, and that was enough. One evening, as I was cleaning up after dinner, David called. "What is it?" I asked, balancing the phone on my shoulder as I wiped down the counter. "I just wanted to say thank you," he said. "For everything you've done for the boys. For keeping things stable." I paused, caught off guard. "You don't need to thank me for that. They're my kids." "I know," he said. "But I didn't make it easy for you, and I'm sorry. I'm really trying to do better." I softened, just slightly. "I hope you do." We hung up shortly after, and for the first time, I felt like we were finally on the same page. Not as a couple, but as co-parents. Life wasn't perfect, but it was good. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough. By the time winter arrived, I'd built a life that felt entirely my own. The house, once a space filled with memories of David, now reflected me and the boys. Their drawings hung on the fridge, the shelves were lined with books I loved, and the air was always filled with music or laughter. It was ours, and it felt whole. Tom had become a steady presence in my life. We'd taken things slowly, and after 6 months, I finally introduced him to the boys. They were wary at first, understandably so, but Tom had a gentle way about him that won them over. He never tried to be their dad, instead, he became something more subtle, a safe, steady figure they could trust. David noticed the change. On one of his visits to pick up the kids, he lingered by the door, watching them pile into his car. "They seem happy," he said, almost to himself. "They are," I replied simply. He looked at me then, his expression softer than it had been in years. "You seem happy too." "I am," I said. There was no anger in my voice, no bitterness. Just the truth. For a moment, it felt like we were two old friends catching up, rather than a divorced couple who had once shared a life. And that was when I realized I'd finally let go of the hurt. It didn't mean I'd forgotten, it just meant it didn't define me anymore. The following spring, I stood in the backyard, watching as the boys played with a soccer ball Tom had brought over. The sun was warm on my skin, the air filled with the scent of blooming flowers. For the first time in years, I felt a sense of peace I couldn't quite put into words. "Mom," my youngest called, waving me over. "Come play." I laughed, shaking my head. "I'm not as fast as I used to be, you know." "You're fast enough," he insisted, and Tom chimed in with an encouraging nod. I kicked off my sandals and ran barefoot onto the grass, my laughter mingling with theirs. In that moment, under the wide, open sky, I felt something I hadn't felt in years: freedom. Freedom from the past, from the weight of betrayal, from the version of myself I'd been afraid to lose. This was my life now, a life I'd rebuilt from the ground up. And though it hadn't been easy, it had been worth it. Every tear, every sleepless night, every hard decision had led me here. As I looked at my boys, their faces flushed with joy, and at Tom, who watched with quiet affection, I realized something. I wasn't just surviving anymore. I was thriving. That night, as I tucked the boys into bed, my eldest hugged me tight. "Mom," he whispered, "are we gonna be okay?" "We already are," I said, kissing his forehead. And for the first time, I truly believed it. When I closed their bedroom door, I stood in the hallway for a moment, letting the quiet of the house settle around me. It wasn't the life I'd imagined all those years ago, but it was mine. And for the first time, it felt more than enough.